If you've ever read any Charles Dickens novels, especially Great Expectations, then you'll have run into Newgate Prison. The hulking notorious jail loomed large in London's history before its demolition in 1902. While accurate execution statistics are difficult to find, there's a suggestion that over 1,000 people faced capital punishment at the prison between 1790 and 1902. The old execution bell still rests in a glass case in nearby St Sepulchre-without-Newgate, rung the night before an execution as a reminder to the condemned. So how did this prison gain such a fearsome reputation, and how has that survived well beyond its early 20th century demolition? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing the theme of buildings with fearsome reputations with Newgate Prison, and I do mean the London one, and we might as well jump straight into the episode. So, mention of a prison in the Newgate area first appears in 1189, and Newgate was originally the prison for London and Middlesex. It housed serious offenders from outside the area alongside local criminals, but its terrible reputation actually began as early as the 14th century, thanks to its barbaric conditions and cruel warders. People actually hated Newgate so much that the population attacked the building whenever they got the chance. In 1381, Wat Tyler's revolt damaged some of the building's structure, although money from Richard Whittington's will actually helped to rebuild the prison in 1423. And yes, it's that Dick Whittington, and I do have an episode on him as well. But that's why the prison gained the nickname Whittington's Palace. Despite the rebuild, Newgate again fell into disrepair, becoming a semi-ruin by 1666. The Great Fire of London caused a great deal of damage, and the prison was rebuilt in 1672. More rebuilding work began in 1770, though fire destroyed most of that during the Gordon Riots in 1780. Another rebuild finished in 1783, although conditions didn't improve and came under criticism from reformers Elizabeth Fry and John Howard. A parliamentary inquiry was launched in 1814, but few were interested in prison reform, so it led to no real improvements. In 1850, a select committee actually named Newgate one of England's worst prisons. Many prisoners moved to Holloway Prison in 1852, and Newgate continued to house those awaiting execution or trial. It was finally demolished in 1902 with the Central Criminal Court built on the site, and opened in 1907. The court took its nickname from the street on which it stood, the Old Bailey. So that's a little bit of a potted history, and I think one of the things that Newgate is often associated with is executions, because executions transferred to the street Old Bailey alongside Newgate from Tyburn in 1783. The warders actually built a scaffold near a door in the prison wall, but later they mounted the scaffold on wheels and then rolled it in and out of the prison when needed. The first execution in Old Bailey fell on 9th of December 1783, when 10 lost their lives, and 20 were hanged on one day in 1785. The tight space and lack of room to move made Old Bailey a rather dangerous sight, though this barely affected the carnival atmosphere on execution days. Those who expressed concerns about the size of the crowds were called mourning Jeremiads, although in 1807 a crowd of 40,000 turned up to watch the execution of two murderers, Haggerty and Holloway. The pressure among the crowd was so intense that panic broke out, and the crowd trampled anyone who fell. 28 people died and almost 70 were injured. Lord Byron was actually one of the celebrities present for the hanging of John Bellingham, the assassin of Prime Minister Spencer Perceval in 1812. Newgate saw the last public execution in Britain on 26th of May 1868, and executions moved behind closed doors after that, although the last executions in Britain would come almost a century later in 1964. But I think one of the things that definitely gives it more of its awful reputation than anything else is the conditions, because obviously the executions do come quite late to Newgate considering the length of its history, but its conditions are pretty much a mainstay from the word go. And the prison boasted a filthy water supply, it had no ventilation, and apparently it was also famous for an awful stench that attached itself to everyone and everything inside the building, and various descriptions talk about the way the stench kind of seeped into things and then you could never get free of it again. Regular outbreaks of jail fever, a type of typhoid, killed the inmates. Prisoners fell upon new arrivals, taking the contents of their pockets and using any money to buy everyone a drink, because surprisingly, alcohol was widely available for sale in the prison tap room, and prison officials made huge profits on the sale of spirits. Warders charged prisoners for all manner of things, from removing their shackles to accessing clean drinking water or having bread that hadn't actually gone stale yet, and even wanting to approach the fire or having a blanket carried a fee. How the warders treated prisoners depended less on their class or crime and more on how much the prisoners could pay them. Now, most prisoners spent time in Newgate between the court and either the gallows or the transportation ship, yet some lived there until they died because they couldn't buy their freedom when their terms ended. And the other thing that becomes quite important is the fact that warders charged the public admission to view the condemned. Now, some of the prisoners were arrogant, some of them had undergone religious conversion, and others were just in shock. And the prison charged fees depending on how popular or notorious the prison was. In 1724, Jack Sheppard was one of the most popular prisoners as a minor robber who became famous as an escapologist, but we are going to come back to him because he's actually really interesting. Surprisingly, Newgate wasn't the worst prison, and in 1729 a parliamentary committee reported that 300 inmates actually died in less than 3 months in Marshalsea prison, and in the same prison over 350 debtors were dying of starvation. William Hogarth painted an image of a committee meeting, including the torture instruments and fetters used at the Fleet prison. But it's Newgate that's the one that people think of if you think of notorious prisons in London. So as we saw with Bedlam, popular culture played a rather large role in affecting the public perception of the jail. Now bear in mind, people hated the jail as early as the 12th century, but I think popular culture is what helps to sustain that reputation. And even the design of Newgate Prison was intended to terrify the viewer, particularly in its Victorian incarnation, because its lack of exterior windows made it look dark, gloomy and forbidding. So the first element of popular culture that I actually want to have a look at are the dying confessions, and one place that we might turn for evidence about a criminal's exploits is this dying confession. And these were printed sheets that were often sold on execution days and would largely contain some kind of tale of the exploits of the criminal in question, any confession that they might make, any conversion and all that kind of thing. And the printed sheets basically added to the folklore around these particular criminals, turning them into legends in the process. They came to encapsulate the idea of Newgate, since it was a Newgate employee that invented them in the 17th century. Specifically, that was Henry Goodcole, Newgate's first full-time chaplain between 1620 and 1641. He produced printed broadsheets about the criminal's offence and then sold them to execution audiences. The details were likely embellished, but the confessions were popular with crowds, and they brought the chaplain a hefty salary, so it became quite a competitive job to try to be the Newgate chaplain because of the fact you could make a fortune selling these dying confessions. And while the confessions likely contained misinformation, and I dare say probably disinformation as well, they also then went on to inspire fiction written about the criminal in question, because in some cases it was the only actual source of information about the criminal and what they had allegedly done. But the fact that they are invented by someone who worked at Newgate does then help to tie those in the public imagination with Newgate itself. We also have the Newgate novels, and the prison actually gave rise to this subgenre of prison novels between the late 1820s and early 1840s. The novels drew stories of crime from the Newgate calendar, which was published in early centuries, and it was essentially a bit like a collection of the dying confessions, so it was almost like an encyclopedia of inmates who had passed through Newgate. And these stories were supposed to offer moral improvement, although people basically read them the same way that people devour true crime today. But the ensuing novels tended towards sensation and melodrama, and obviously turned quite far away from any sense of moral improvement. And their critics ended up deriding them for romanticising crime and inviting sympathy with criminals. Paul Clifford by Edward Bulwer Lytton and Rookwood by William Harrison Ainsworth were two of the more well-known of these novels. And Rookwood is the one that essentially romanticises Dick Turpin and completely creates this legend about him that just didn't really exist, and made him this romanticised figure rather than the hardened criminal that he actually was. Author William Makepeace Thackeray accused Charles Dickens of writing a Newgate novel when he wrote Oliver Twist, but it was Ainsworth's Jack Sheppard that saw the genre's peak in 1839, which told the apparent story of a thief who escaped Newgate. It sold 300 copies a week when issued in volume form, and by the end of 1839, 8 different adaptations ran in London theatres as well. The popularity of this novel and accompanying play unfortunately gave audiences too many ideas about crime and how to actually commit it. In 1840, valet Francois Benjamin Courvoisier murdered Lord William Russell, his master. While Courvoisier denied the play about Shepherd provided any inspiration for the murder, the wider press claimed a link between the two and just outright stated that the play was what had actually inspired the act. The Lord Chamberlain then banned any plays about Shepherd, fearing their negative influence, and the Newgate novel finally attracted plenty of criticism. Ainsworth and Lytton just simply changed genres and stopped writing them, which is one way of solving the problem, while Charles Dickens made sure to make any criminal characters as unlikable as possible. Now, he had already written A Visit to Newgate as part of his Sketches by Boz in 1836, describing the architecture of the prison alongside biographies of the inmates, but he very much went down the route of, yes, these are criminal characters, you're not supposed to like them. Many of the themes that were popular in Newgate novels then went on to inspire stories in the lurid penny dreadfuls that followed. But as we've just seen, Jack Sheppard was not only popular with the public, but the novel about his life was equally popular, and he even gave an account of his life to Daniel Defoe, who then published that account within a few months of Sheppard's death. Now, I do want to note, Sheppard wasn't the only escapee from Newgate, because Henry Williams escaped in 1836, and he had learned various tricks as a sweeps boy, but managed to climb the 50-foot wall in the exercise yard before essentially walking away to freedom. But as Sheppard is by far the more famous of the two, who exactly was he? And I'm going to just include a very potted biography of him because there's actually quite a lot to go through, and I don't want this entire episode to be about him, but it's worth knowing some of his background. So he was born in Spitalfields in March 1702 and ended up in a workhouse school at the age of 6 following the death of his father and sister. And his mother had basically gone into domestic service, which is why he was in the workhouse school. Now, luckily, his mother's employer took him on as a shop boy, and he lived with his mother and her employer until he was 15. But at 21, he fell into his life of crime to fund his drinking and affair with a sex worker known as Edgeworth Bess. He started by stealing 2 silver spoons while on a job in Charing Cross, and his thieving career took off. Eventually, he was caught by Jonathan Wilde, a thief-taker and criminal in his own right, and Sheppard faced 3 charges of burglary. He was actually acquitted on the first 2 for lack of evidence, but testimony from his former accomplices saw him sentenced to death for the third. He made his first daring escape from Newgate after someone smuggled in tools to another condemned prisoner, so Sheppard filed through one of the spikes separating the condemned cell from the rest of the prison and squeezed through the gap. Edgeworth Bess and one of her friends, Poll Maggot, came to visit him and passed him a nightgown and bonnet. Poll hid while Bess and Sheppard, dressed as Poll, walked out of the prison. So obviously the guards had seen 2 women come in and what they thought were 2 women go back out. Poll then later left completely unnoticed. Sheppard left London to lie low in Oxford for a few days, but soon grew bored and returned to the metropolis, and eventually he was recaptured and returned to Newgate. This time he was chained to the floor and guarded day and night. The staff actually charged visitors 3 shillings and 6pence to come in and see him. Later, the warders moved Sheppard to a cell above the prison gate that they believed was stronger than the others, and they also refused Sheppard's offer to pay for the removal of his chains, so he had visitors bring in tools for him instead. So not only did Sheppard escape the chains again, but he also demonstrated to the amazed warders how he managed it. Eventually, he managed to climb the chimney in his cell to reach the cell above, then broke through a series of 6 doors to reach the chapel, which provided access to the roof. Once on the roof, he got across to the neighbouring building, broke into that, and then headed down to the street to let himself out. Apparently, he didn't even wake the family whose house it was, so that's how quiet he was. Unfortunately, he was recaptured again and hanged on the 16th of November 1724. But he does help to draw quite a lot of attention to Newgate because it was believed to be impregnable and you weren't supposed to be able to escape from Newgate, and he managed it twice. So you can see why he became quite popular with the public who already hated Newgate, and here was a guy who, by all accounts, seems to have been quite charismatic anyway, but also essentially walked out of Newgate twice. So he essentially was escaping from the thing that a lot of people hated. So I think he does help to add to Newgate's reputation in a way that you don't really get with the other prisons because they're not associated with a figure like him. Now obviously we couldn't end this episode without looking at some ghost stories, and Newgate's formidable reputation gave it 2 stories in particular that underlined both the building and the types of criminals that it housed. So in the first, Amelia Dyer, the baby farmer, was executed at Newgate on 10th of June 1896, and if you're not familiar with baby farming, it's a horrible practice, and it was where women would take in babies that the mothers couldn't look after for whatever reason, and the mothers would pay them to look after them, often while they worked, but the baby farmers would usually do away with the babies and then continue to claim the money for them. truly reprehensible individuals, and Dyer was eventually caught and, like I say, executed. But while she caused no actual trouble while she was in prison, she did make the wardens incredibly uncomfortable. And she told the chief warder that she would meet him again in the future on her way to the scaffold, which obviously would be quite unnerving. So one evening a few years later, the chief warder was sitting with colleagues enjoying some whiskey when he happened to look up and saw Amelia grinning at him through the door grill. When he opened the door, the corridor was completely empty, aside from a handkerchief fluttering to the door. Now, Newgate no longer held female prisoners, so who exactly was it that he'd seen at the door? The other ghost story, which I think is perhaps more famous, is that of the Black Dog of Newgate, and we know how much I love a black dog here on Fabulous Folklore. But the first printed version of this legend appeared in The Discovery of a London Monster Called the Black Dog of Newgate, profitable for all readers to take heed by, which was published in 1596 and attributed to prison inmate Luke Hutton. Now, in the story, a scholar turned sorcerer ended up in Newgate during a famine in the reign of Henry III. The famine stretched to the prison, and the desperate inmates resorted to cannibalism. They fell upon the scholar, who was unable to defend himself, but soon after his death, the prisoners reported seeing a huge black dog striding around the prison. They became convinced that the scholar had returned, hell-bent on vengeance, and the legend claimed that the black dog hunted down those responsible. The last survivors were so terrified that they even escaped, although the legend also suggests that the black dog hunted them down too. At the end of the story, the narrator claims that the legend is actually all false, and the black dog refers to a black stone in the condemned cell. Alternatively, other people have suggested it may have referred to the Black Dog public house. But having this kind of story of a sorcerer essentially in the walls of Newgate, and then given rise to a murderous black dog, which is either the sorcerer in a new guise or some kind of familiar for him, obviously that all again added to the face and reputation of Newgate for the type of people that it held. But what do we ultimately make of the link between Newgate, popular culture, and its reputation? Now, as we did say earlier on, people dreaded incarceration in many prisons, such as Marshalsea or the Fleet, and also there's Bridewell as well that has a bit of a reputation. Yet Newgate looms large among them as a particularly dreaded institution. Reports of the horrific conditions, jail fever and cruel warders circulate among the population, although they did seem to do little to deter the actual act of committing crime. The prison's reputation was cemented long before the emergence of the Newgate novel, and the Dying Confessions helped to create the reputations of its inmates. Yet the Newgate novel no doubt helped to ensure we see the prison in a particular way now, because the novels are easier to interact with and have also gone on to influence other forms of culture. We've also lost a lot of the oral description about Newgate that would have been circulating at the time, whereas the novels managed to capture that in print and preserve it so that we can't interact with it here in the 21st century. Essentially, if Newgate hadn't already had a reputation, we likely wouldn't have had the Newgate novel, and there would have just been generic prison novels. But even though Newgate was demolished in 1902, we can still think of the depressing conditions, lack of clean water, rampant disease, and training schools for apprentice criminals within its walls. While prisons now accrue their own folklore in the form of ghost stories, and I have an episode about that as well, Newgate in particular haunts London's law as a site of punishment and execution. There is one wall of it that remains, apparently, which you can see somewhere in the Old Bailey area, but otherwise there's very little of the prison left to see now, and I think that also helps to cement its reputation in that its idea haunts London even if the building no longer stands. So I am curious if you'd heard of Newgate Prison yourself. Obviously, have you heard of any of these figures before? Have you read any of the Newgate novels? If you have, it'll probably be the Dickens ones, to be fair. But how do you imagine Newgate Prison based on the kind of reputation that it has, or indeed how I've described it here? So let me know what you think, and that would be quite interesting. Next week, we're actually going to leave London and we're going to have a look at the fearsome reputation that another prison had. This one is still standing, but it no longer has the same function, and it's the prison at the Doge's Palace in Venice. And obviously that's where we get the Bridge of Sighs and everything from. So I thought that one might be quite good to have a look at, because essentially being arrested at all and ending up in the Doge's Palace or the Doge's Prison were quite terrifying things. So I thought that would be quite a good one to have a look at. And this is all building up to us having a look at the Amityville house at the end of the month. So I hope you look forward to that one as well. And I do also have the episode of Fabulous Folklore Presents coming this month, and I'm going to be speaking to Owen Davies and Kerry Houlbrook about their new book, Folklore, A Journey Through the Past and Present. So if you are interested in how folklore itself works and how it's actually studied and how we interact with it here in the 21st century, then that will be the Fabulous Folklore Presents interview for you. So I hope that you enjoy that as well. And just a final reminder that if you are in Newcastle on the 20th of October, I am doing a talk about Haunted Tyneside at Newcastle Castle. So it would be lovely to see you there if you're around. And if you're in London on the 29th of October, then I will be making an appearance at Treadwell's Books as part of a panel discussion talking about ghosts and witches and all kinds of spooky folklore right in time for Halloween. So the links for both of those talks are in the show notes if you are around and you would like to come to either of them. But other than that, I hope you are well, and I will see you next week when we have a look at the Doge's Palace. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.